Hey everyone, Mark here. So this tutorial video is simply to illustrate the differences between component and PureComponent, the two classes that React provides that we can inherit from when we're creating components. There's a lot of ambiguity I found online about when to use PureComponent, even in answers on Stack Overflow and whatnot. I sense that there's still confusion about where we should use this PureComponent. So this tutorial is going to describe a very minimal example where it would be beneficial to use a pure component versus a regular component. Okay, so and then just as a side note, I do have all of this code up on my GitHub, which I will link in the comments section of the video, which you can check out either while I am talking or afterwards. Okay, so without further ado, let's plunge into the little code example I have here. There's a couple things to note about this to explain it. The first thing is I have these two components, first name and last name. If I open first name, you'll see it's very simple. All it does is console log something when it's rendering, and then just returns a prop that's passed to it inside of a span. And the last name component does the exact same thing. The console log says it's rendering the last name, and then just returns the prop. Okay, so that's what these two components do here, and that's all that this component renders is these two components. And then the state of this parent component is the first name and last name state variables. Both of them are initialized to random math numbers, or random numbers, not just math numbers. And then the important part, though, is in this component did mount. So what this is doing is it's calling the set interval function, and then it's running this callback right here, or this .set state, basically. It's running this every 2 seconds. And it's doing that for total of 6 seconds before I cancel the set interval function. And so the set state, though, what this is going to do essentially is set the state of first name 3 or 4 times. Every 2 seconds, it'll reset the state of first name. And the expected behavior when this happens is that since the first name state variable is changing, and that since we're passing in that first name as a prop into the first name component, only the first name component should re-render, right? The parent should re-render here, and then the first name component should re-render because it's dependent on the state that was just set. However, you'll notice that the last name prop never actually, or state I should say, never gets changed outside of the initial constructor function here that's setting the state. Other than this, the last name never gets changed. So we expect the last name component to never have to re-render since the last name state has never been updated. Okay, so let's save this up, and I'm going to run this application, and we'll see what happens. It'll tell us exactly what's logging and when. Okay, now that our server, Webpack dev server, is up and running, let's refresh the page here and look at the console output down here. Okay, forgetting all these events, let's look at the console output down here. And okay, so that's it. So the set interval has been canceled. These are everything that was logged. So you can see that it's always rendering first name, and it's also rendering last name. We expect the first rendering here of first name and last name to occur because this happens when the constructor is called for the app component. But then after that, each subsequent call here, the first name, last name, first name, last name, and first name, last name, that's 3 calls to set state, where it was only changing the state in first name. But you can see here that when we did that, the first name component and the last name component got re-rendered. Okay, so for some reason, this last name component is getting re-rendered every time the first name state is changing. Okay, so we don't want that to happen, right? So we can do one of 2 things to mitigate this. The first thing is if we go to last name, React gives us a really handy lifecycle callback called should component update. Okay, and this takes in the new props and the new state that the component is going to get. And as the name indicates, it returns a Boolean. If you return true, then React will indeed update this component, as in it will re-render it. And if you return false, then React will never call the render method again. And so by default, for the component class, React implements this like that, essentially. It will always re-render this component if it gets props and state. Whether or not the new props or the new state is any different from the previous props or the previous state, React is always going to re-render this component every time its parent's props change. every time its parent's component state change. That may be confusing. Let me go back here for a second. What I'm saying is this: whenever this component, which is the parent component of last name, whenever the set state function is called in the parent component, it causes the parent to re-render. And when the parent re-renders, it also causes the first name and last name components to re-render. However, we don't want the last name component to re-render since the props that we're passing down to it haven't changed, okay? So what we can do here is run some logic in here to tell React whether it should update this component or not. So what we want to say is return and then new props dot name not equal to this dot props dot name. So this dot props is essentially equal to the previous props, right? And the new props are the ones that are being passed in from the parent component's re-render. And so if the new props dot name is no different than the previous props or the current ones, then we don't want to re-render, right? We only want to re-render if the name in the new props is actually different from the current props name. Okay, so if we do that and save this up, go back to Chrome here, re-render, rendering first name, rendering first name, rendering first name down here. Okay, I don't know what this output is. It's really annoying. Anyhow, this only rendered the first name, right? 3 times. And that's exactly what we wanted to have happen. Now, last name isn't actually re-rendering because we're stopping that re-render from occurring here in the should component update. Now, you may be asking, well, where does PureComponent come in? Well, PureComponent essentially comes in right here. Since this is a common use case, and we don't always just want to update our components regardless of what's passed into them, we want to be a little bit more selective about when we re-render our components, especially if you have a ton of components in your application. You want to only re-render components when they really need to be re-rendered. And so we can use React's built-in PureComponent class to do this. So it just gets imported the same way as component does. And then we'll just say extends PureComponent. Now I can get rid of all of this, keep the render there, and now renders first name and last name. Now it just renders first name, right? So this is essentially what we just did with the PureComponent is the exact same thing as extending a regular component and then also implementing the should component update callback. Now, if we try to implement the should component update callback now, and we just say we never want to do it, let's fix in the new props, new state. We should get a warning in the console. It says last name has a method called should component update. Should component update should not be used when extending React.PureComponent. Please extend React.Component if should component update is used. So basically React is saying, look, if you're going to implement PureComponent, you do not need to implement should component update. In fact, you shouldn't implement this method. The reason for that is because the PureComponent class already implements the should component update in a specific way. Specifically, the PureComponent class implements the should component update by doing a shallow equal comparison on the new props in the new state compared to the old props in the old state. And so what I'll do, I will go to the README here, which is on GitHub. You can check that out. And I will show the markdown here. So if you can see down here, this code right here is what React is going to execute if your component is a pure component, right? So it checks, it says, is it a pure React component? If it is, then only update if the old props are not equal to the new props, and it does a shallow equal. Okay, so it won't check nested object properties or anything like that. Basically, the old props can't equal the new props, and the old state can't equal the new state. If those old state and new state are different, or if the old props and new props are different, then it will still re-render the component. But if they're the same, then it won't re-render it. So as you can see, the should component update is already implemented essentially for a pure component. Okay, so that is most everything I wanted to get to on this. The main takeaway here is that you essentially always want to use PureComponent if your component is a direct function of the props and the state that are passed into it. That is, if your component always renders the exact same output given the same props and the same state, then it's safe to use the PureComponent class. And in fact, I would recommend it. That way you don't have a number of useless re-renders occurring in your application for no reason. Yeah, so that's pretty much everything I have. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comment section. If you like this video, please like, and then please subscribe as well. I will be doing more videos like this. If you have any suggestions for me, please pass them along my way as well. Thank you guys for listening.